The sunlight used to pour into this living room like a blessing. Now it just feels like an uninvited guest touching the dust on furniture no one has sat on in years. I'm 71 years old, and I still find myself setting the table for 3. Habit, I suppose. My daughter used to tease me for it, said I could never break free from routine. Maybe she was right. But when you've lived long enough, routines are the last proof that you once had people to live for. I still remember that afternoon vividly, the day they said they'd come back next week. It was a Sunday, late spring. The air smelled like lilacs from the garden I'd planted when the kids were still small. I'd spent the morning cooking, filling the kitchen with the scent of roast chicken and cinnamon pie, their favorites. I was humming some old tune from the radio when my daughter Evelyn looked up from her phone and said, "Mom, we'll come back next week, okay? You don't need to fuss every time we visit." She smiled quick and distant. I didn't realize then that her smile was already a goodbye. Next week never came. The first few months, I waited rearranging the cushions, baking pies that went untouched, buying new table runners for the dining room as if the right color might make them remember. But as weeks turned to months and months turned to years, silence settled over the house like a second skin. I told myself they were busy. I told myself I understood. But every time I checked the mailbox and saw nothing from them, a little piece of that understanding cracked. It's been 5 years now, and yet every Sunday I still wake up before dawn, still prepare their favorite breakfast, scrambled eggs with chives toast lightly buttered. I still open the curtains wide, as if I'm expecting headlights to roll into the driveway. And each time they don't, the silence mocks me. Sometimes I talk to myself, pretending I'm talking to Evelyn. I tell her about the rose bush that finally bloomed again after the frost. I tell her about the new neighbors who moved in next door, a young couple with 2 little girls who remind me of her and her brother when they were small. I tell her that the old dog Murphy passed away one cold night last winter. I buried him under the big oak tree behind the house, the same one where she used to hang her tire swing. I tell her all of that as if she can hear me, though deep down, I know she's not listening. But I wasn't always this way, waiting, remembering, aching. Once, I was someone who built, who worked, who gave. I raised my children on my own after their father walked out when they were still in grade school. I worked double shifts at the diner, took sewing jobs at night, and still found time to make their lunches, help with homework, and cheer at every school play. Evelyn was the bright one, ambitious, driven. She always said she'd make life easier for me one day. "You'll never have to work again, Mom," she promised. "I'll take care of you." But promises fade faster than memories. The last time we truly talked, not the casual surface words, but really talked, was the night before she married Michael. I remember the look in her eyes that evening, half excitement, half guilt. She asked me to promise that I'd be happy for her, that I wouldn't feel lonely once she moved to the city. "You've always been strong," she said, holding my hand. "I'll visit all the time." I smiled and told her not to worry. But when they drove away after the wedding, I felt something hollow open inside me, a space I couldn't name yet. It began small. Missed calls, short texts. "Sorry, Mom, super busy this week." Then maybe next month. Then silence. And somehow, between her life of meetings and my life of waiting, the thread that once tied us together began to fray. At first, I blamed myself. Maybe I'd been too overbearing, too protective, too much. Maybe I made her feel guilty for having a life beyond me. I replayed every conversation in my head, every tone, every sigh. I told myself that if I'd just stayed quiet that one time, if I hadn't argued about her moving so far away, if I hadn't questioned her husband's decisions, maybe she would have come back. But as the years slipped away, guilt gave way to something darker, realization. It wasn't distance that separated us. It was choice. She chose to forget me. The truth of that hit me the day I accidentally stumbled upon a social media post. My neighbor's teenage son helped me set up a tablet, and one afternoon, curious, I typed her name into the search bar. Her profile came up: smiling faces, luxury dinners, birthday parties. There she was, my daughter, laughing in a house I'd never seen, surrounded by people I'd never met. The caption read, "Family is everything." I stared at those words until the screen dimmed. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with Murphy at my feet, staring at the empty chair where she used to sit. Family is everything. The irony was almost cruel. I wanted to hate her. I wanted to delete every memory, every bedtime story, every Christmas morning we shared. But love doesn't just vanish because someone stops deserving it. It lingers like perfume on an old scarf, faint but stubborn. It was around that time that my son Nathan called me out of the blue. We hadn't spoken much either, though, for different reasons. He lived out west, said he was traveling for work. But that day, his voice carried a strange tension. "Mom," he said, "we need to talk about something." I could tell by his tone it wasn't good. He hesitated before continuing, and my heart raced as if bracing for an accident I couldn't see yet. "It's about Evelyn," he finally said. There's something you should know." What he told me next shattered what little peace I had left. Apparently, Evelyn had been telling people that I was difficult, manipulative, even emotionally abusive, that she'd had to cut ties for her own well-being. She'd told her friends, maybe even her husband, that she grew up in a toxic home, that I had made her life miserable. For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. I wanted to deny it outright, but then something inside me went quiet. I remembered all the times she'd snapped at me in recent years, all the bitterness hidden behind polite words. I remembered the day she told me, "Mom, you don't understand boundaries," when all I'd done was show up unannounced to bring her soup when she was sick. I realized then maybe she'd been rewriting the story for a long time just to make sense of her own choices. I didn't tell Nathan how much it hurt. I just listened, nodding, pretending I already knew. After all, what could I say? How could I defend myself to someone who'd already chosen her truth over mine? But something inside me changed that day. For years, I'd been waiting helplessly, pathetically, like a ghost clinging to the living. But after that phone call, I stopped waiting. I started remembering not the way she wanted me to, but the way it really was. The nights I stayed up sewing her prom dress. The mornings I skipped breakfast so she'd have lunch money. The hours I worked to buy her that first car. I remembered, and with each memory, the fog of guilt began to lift. One day, I pulled out the old photo albums from the attic. Dust coated the covers like a thin layer of grief. I sat by the window, flipping through page after page, her first steps, her first day of school, her graduation, the wedding. My hands trembled, not from age, but from anger. How easily she'd erased me. But among those photos, I found something I'd forgotten: a letter. It was folded between the pages of her high school yearbook. My handwriting on the envelope read, "For Evelyn, when you need to remember who you are." I must have written it years ago, maybe when she left for college. Inside, I'd told her how proud I was, how much I believed in her, how I hoped she'd never forget where she came from. My words felt like a message from a younger version of myself, reaching across time to remind me love was never my mistake. That night, I lit a candle and read the letter out loud. Then, for the first time in 5 years, I cried, not from loneliness, but release. Still, forgiveness didn't come easily. It never does. Months passed before I spoke to anyone about it. Then one morning, I saw that young couple next door playing with their daughters in the yard. The little girls were laughing, their mother chasing them with open arms, hair flying in the sunlight. Something about that scene broke me open all over again. I thought, that used to be me. And for a moment, I wanted revenge, not the kind that destroys, but the kind that reminds. I wanted her to see me again, To know I was still here, still standing. Not a ghost, not a villain, just a mother who loved too much and lost too much because of it. So I decided to do something I never thought I would. I began to write her a letter, not a plea, not an apology, but the truth. Every line bled honesty. I told her how her silence had aged me more than time ever could. I told her that I'd seen her posts, her smiles, her perfect life, and that I hoped they brought her peace. I told her I forgave her, not because she asked for it, but because I deserved to let go. I ended the letter with one sentence. You said you'd visit next week. It's been 5 years. I'm still here. I sealed the envelope and placed it on the kitchen table, but I never mailed it. Instead, I left it there a silent monument to everything unspoken. The letter stayed on that table for weeks, untouched, but never ignored. Each morning, I'd pass by it with my cup of coffee, my eyes tracing the name I'd written in careful cursive, Evelyn. I kept waiting for something inside me to change, for anger to fade, or hope to flicker back to life. But neither happened. It was strange living in that quiet space between forgiveness and heartbreak. You learn that love doesn't end with goodbye. It lingers, it reshapes it, survives even when it shouldn't. One afternoon, as the golden light streamed through the curtains, I caught myself humming again. It startled me, the sound of my own voice in that silence. I hadn't sung in years, not since before the distance began. I used to hum while cooking, while folding laundry, while waiting by the window. Now it felt foreign, almost defiant to hear melody in a house that had forgotten laughter. Maybe in a small way I was remembering who I used to be, someone who found beauty in the smallest things. That same day, I decided to go into town for the first time in months. The grocery store cashier, a kind woman named Lydia, smiled when she saw me. "Haven't seen you in a while, Miss Harper," she said. I didn't correct her. It felt good to be called something with familiarity, even if it wasn't quite me anymore. As I paid for my things, she asked, "Do you have family visiting soon?" And I froze. My lips parted, but no words came out. She didn't mean harm, of course. Small-town politeness always fills the silence with questions. Still, that single sentence unraveled something in me. "No," I said softly, "not in a long time." Her face changed, that awkward pity people wear when they realize they've touched a wound they didn't know existed. She nodded quickly, handed me my change, and said, "Well, they'll come around. They always do." But they don't always come around. That's the cruel truth no one likes to admit. Some people leave, and that leaving becomes permanent, not because of death, but because of pride or fear or the convenience of forgetting. When I got home that evening, the house felt colder than usual. I made myself tea and sat by the window, watching the streetlight flicker on. The letter was still on the table, its edges curling slightly. For the first time, I picked it up and opened it again. My words stared back at me raw and trembling, like the voice of someone braver than I felt. I realized then that I hadn't written that letter for her. I'd written it for me. It was my confession, my closure, my way of letting the pain out instead of letting it rot inside me. I folded it neatly, placed it inside an old biscuit tin, and tucked it in the cabinet beside the family photo albums. Somewhere deep down, I think I wanted her to find it one day. Not now, not soon, but maybe when I'm gone. Maybe then, she'll finally listen. As summer turned to fall, the loneliness shifted into something different. Not softer, but familiar, like an old scar that no longer hurts, but still aches when it rains. I started volunteering at the community center, mostly just to have faces to talk to. I'd help prepare meals for the elderly group, folding napkins, setting tables, listening to stories of people who, like me, had become ghosts in their own families. There was comfort in that, knowing I wasn't the only one who'd been forgotten by the very people they'd raised. One woman, Doris, used to sit beside me every Tuesday. She had this laugh that could fill a whole room. One afternoon, she said something that stayed with me ever since. "You know, Helen, that's me. Helen Harper, the thing about motherhood is that it's a love with no exit door. You can't undo it, can't outgrow it. Even when they forget us, we don't stop loving them. It's the most foolish kind of love, but also the most honest." I smiled, though my eyes burned. "And what do we do with all that love once there's no one to give it to?" I asked her. She chuckled. "We give it to ourselves, dear. Took me 78 years to learn that." That night, I couldn't sleep. Her words kept circling in my mind, stubborn and true. I got up, wrapped a shawl around my shoulders, and walked through the house. Every corner whispered memories, Evelyn's laughter echoing from her old room, Nathan's muddy boots by the back door, the hum of the old refrigerator that used to buzz louder when the kids snuck in for midnight snacks. I realized I'd spent so many years keeping this house like a shrine, preserving the ghosts instead of living among the living. The next morning, I made a decision. I took down the heavy drapes and replaced them with sheer white curtains that let the sunlight in. I moved the furniture around, painted the hallway a soft blue, and gave away half the dishes I never used. And for the first time in years, I bought myself flowers, yellow tulips. I used to say they were Evelyn's favorite, but maybe they were mine all along. It felt strange, almost rebellious to fill this house with color again. Still, part of me wondered if they'd ever see it. If she'd ever walk through that door and notice the little changes, the curtains, the flowers, the light. Maybe she'd laugh and say, "You finally redecorated, Mom." Maybe she'd remember the house not as a burden, but as a place that loved her. But deep down, I knew better. Some things stay broken no matter how gently you try to fix them. Winter came fast that year. The first snow fell on a quiet Sunday morning. I stood by the window, coffee steaming in my hand, watching the world turn white. I thought about all the winters before, the ones filled with laughter, the sound of carols, the smell of cinnamon cookies. Now, the only sound was the creak of the house and the ticking of the clock. It was around that time that I received a letter, but not from Evelyn. It was from Nathan. He said he'd been thinking about visiting, that he missed home. He didn't say much else, but the thought of one of my children walking back into my life made my heart stumble. I spent the next few days cleaning every corner, baking pies, washing the curtains. It was foolish, I know, but hope is a stubborn thing. When the day came, he arrived just as the sun was setting. I barely recognized him at first, older, heavier eyes, tired but kind. "Hey, Mom," he said softly. And just like that time folded in on itself, we talked for hours about his job, his travels, his regrets. And then hesitantly he mentioned Evelyn. "She's doing okay?" he said, his voice uncertain. "But she doesn't talk about you much. I think she's still processing things." I nodded, pretending not to care. "Processing," I repeated the word, tasting bitter. "She told me once," he continued, "that she feels guilty. She said every time she tries to reach out, she doesn't know what to say, like too much time has passed." That night, after he left, I sat alone in the quiet again. For the first time in a long time, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not sorrow, but a deep, aching understanding. Maybe she wasn't cruel. Maybe she was just afraid to face what she'd done, afraid to see what she'd left behind. And maybe, just maybe, I was afraid too. Afraid that if she did come back, I wouldn't recognize her anymore. Afraid that the years had changed us both beyond repair. Still, I couldn't help it. I whispered her name into the still air like a prayer. Evelyn. The sound of it filled the room and broke the silence just enough for hope to sneak back in, fragile, trembling, but alive. Weeks passed after Nathan's visit, and I found myself replaying every word we shared. His voice, His hesitation, the way he glanced at the photo of Evelyn on the mantel but didn't touch it, it all lingered. He didn't have to say it outright. I knew he pitied me. But pity is still connection, and after so many years of silence, even pity felt like a form of contact. One night, I sat by the fire and reread his letter. I'd tucked it under the clock on the mantel, right beside a photo of the kids when they were still small. Evelyn missing a front tooth, Nathan holding her hand. My thumb traced their smiling faces until my eyes blurred. I wondered if they remembered that day at all. I wondered if they remembered me as I was back then, younger, stronger, full of dreams for them that reached higher than anything I'd ever wanted for myself. It's strange how motherhood changes you. You give and give until you start mistaking your children's lives for your own. You convince yourself that their happiness is your purpose, and when they drift away, you forget how to breathe without them. That's what happened to me. When Evelyn left, I didn't just lose my daughter, I lost the mirror that showed me who I was supposed to be. But life, stubborn as it is, keeps moving forward even when your heart stays behind. I tried to fill the silence with purpose. Volunteering, gardening, church meetings, anything to make the days shorter and the nights bearable. I found small joys where I could the neighbor's dog who'd visit my porch for biscuits, the sound of rain against the windows, the way morning sunlight painted gold across the table. Sometimes I'd think, maybe this is enough. Maybe peace looks like this quiet, ordinary, unfinished. But then something unexpected happened. It was a gray Tuesday in early spring when I received a call from an unfamiliar number. I almost didn't answer, thinking it was another telemarketer. But something, maybe instinct, made me pick up. "Mrs. Harper?" a woman's voice asked. "Yes," I said cautiously. "This is Susan. I'm a nurse at St. Mary's Hospital in Chicago. I'm calling about your daughter Evelyn." My heart dropped. The world seemed to tilt slightly, my breath catching in my chest. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I just listened, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles ached. The nurse continued, her tone gentle but clinical. Evelyn had been admitted after a car accident. She was stable but unconscious, and the hospital had found my contact number listed as her emergency relation. I remember sitting there for several seconds, frozen, the words echoing through me like the toll of a bell. Then everything inside me just moved. I packed a small bag, the same one I used to carry when visiting her as a child at summer camp, and left that evening on the first bus out. The trip felt endless. The road blurred into a wash of headlights and rain, and I sat pressed against the window, my reflection staring back at me, older lined eyes, heavy with both dread and love. I thought about the years between us, the distance carved by silence and pride. I wondered if she'd want to see me. I wondered if she'd hate that I'd come. But none of that mattered. A mother doesn't stop showing up. When I reached the hospital, the antiseptic smell hit me like a wave of memory. I'd spent years in places like this, waiting rooms, sterile corridors, when my husband was sick, when Nathan broke his leg, when Evelyn had pneumonia as a child. But this time was different. This time, the waiting was filled with ghosts. The nurse led me to her room quietly. Evelyn lay there, pale, motionless, hooked up to tubes and machines that hummed with mechanical rhythm. My first thought was how small she looked, how fragile. Her once polished hair was tangled, her skin sallow beneath the fluorescent lights. And yet she was still my little girl. I sat beside her and took her hand, careful not to disturb the IV. It was warm, thank God. For a long time, I just sat there listening to the steady beep of the monitor. I wanted to say something, to pour out years of silence in a single breath, but my throat refused to open. Instead, tears fell quietly down my cheeks, landing on her hand. I don't know how long I stayed that way. Hours, maybe. Time doesn't move the same way when you're waiting for someone to wake up. Eventually, a doctor came in, kind but tired looking. He told me she'd suffered a mild head injury and some broken ribs, but she was expected to recover. "She's lucky," he said. "Someone was watching over her." I smiled faintly at that. Maybe I was. Over the next 2 days, I sat vigil at her bedside. I read aloud from the old book she used to love as a child, Little Women. I hummed her favorite lullaby. I even brushed her hair gently the way I used to after her baths when she was small. Every gesture felt like rewriting the years between us, word by word, breath by breath. Then on the third morning she stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, dazed and glassy. It took her a moment to focus, and when she finally did, her gaze landed on me. For a long second, she didn't speak, just stared, confusion mixing with disbelief. "Mom," she whispered. Her voice cracked on the word. I felt everything inside me collapse. "I'm here, sweetheart," I said, my hand trembling as I touched her face. "I'm right here." Tears welled in her eyes, and for a moment, she looked like the girl who used to run into my arms after school, before life complicated everything. "You came," she said. "Of course I did," I whispered. Silence hung between us, heavy, fragile, full of everything unsaid. Then quietly, she began to cry. Not the soft kind of crying, but the deep shaking sobs that come from years of guilt breaking open. I held her hand and let her cry, feeling her pain as if it were my own. When she could finally speak, she said the words I'd waited 5 years to hear. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I was so angry. I told people things that weren't fair. I wanted to blame someone for how empty I felt. And you were the easiest one to blame." I shook my head gently. "You don't need to explain, Evelyn." But she did anyway. The words spilled out about how motherhood scared her, how she thought cutting me off would make her stronger, how she built walls she couldn't tear down even when she wanted to. And I listened. For the first time in years, I just listened. When she finished, I told her something I didn't even know I'd been carrying. "I forgave you long before you asked. You're my daughter. You don't have to earn my love. You never did." Her eyes filled again, softer this time. She squeezed my hand weakly and whispered, "I don't deserve you." I smiled through tears. "Maybe not, but you still have me." The next few days blurred into quiet moments, the soft hum of machines, the nurse's footsteps, the muted light through the blinds. Evelyn grew stronger. She started walking, eating, even smiling again. Each day we talked more about her life, her mistakes, her regrets. She showed me pictures of her home, her friends, even her husband, though I could sense the strain in her voice when she mentioned him. On the 4th evening, as I was leaving the hospital, she called out softly, "Mom." "Yes." She hesitated, her eyes shining with something fragile. Can I come home with you for a while, just until I feel better?" I didn't trust my voice enough to speak. I just nodded. The morning she came home felt like stepping into a memory that had been asleep for too long. The sky was soft, with early light, the air sharp, with the scent of damp earth after a night of rain. I'd woken before dawn to prepare the guest room, though it wasn't really a guest room. It was still hers. The same lilac curtains, the same quilt I'd sewn when she turned 16, patched and faded from time. When I saw her car pull into the driveway, my breath caught. She moved carefully, slower than before, one hand still resting on her side where her ribs were healing. I went out to help her, but she smiled faintly and shook her head. "I can walk," she said, and I saw the same stubborn spark that had always lived inside her, the one that used to drive me mad and make me proud in equal measure. Inside, she paused in the hallway, looking around quietly. "It hasn't changed much," she said. "Neither have you," I replied softly. She laughed, but it came out half sad. "You're kind, Mom, but I have." We sat at the kitchen table that first morning, just like we used to. I made tea, and she picked at a slice of toast, her eyes wandering to the window to the garden beyond. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't heavy this time. It was cautious, like both of us were afraid to move too fast and break something fragile that had just begun to mend. She finally said, "I saw the letter, the one on the table." I froze, the spoon in my hand clinking against the cup. "You did," she nodded. "Nathan sent me a picture of it before I came. He found it when he visited." She looked down, her voice trembling. "I read every word, Mom. Every single one. I think that's what made me call you." For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. I had written that letter years ago, poured every drop of pain, love, and longing into it, never expecting she'd see it. And yet somehow, it had found its way back to her when I'd already let it go. "I didn't mean for you to feel guilty," I said. "I know," she whispered. "But I needed to. I needed to remember what I'd done, what I'd lost." Her voice cracked, and I saw tears glimmer in her eyes. I reached across the table, covering her hand with mine. It was cold, trembling slightly, but it didn't pull away. "We can't change what happened," I said, "but we can start again." She nodded, silent tears slipping down her cheeks. "I'd like that." That day marked the slow rebuilding of something I'd thought was gone forever. The weeks that followed were quiet, but full of small, tender miracles. I cooked her favorite meals, and she helped me water the garden. We'd sit together on the porch in the evenings, watching the sky turn orange and gold. Sometimes she'd talk about her work, her marriage, the loneliness she'd tried to hide behind busyness. Sometimes she'd just sit in silence, head resting against my shoulder, like she used to as a child. But forgiveness, I learned, is not a single moment. It's a process, 1,000 tiny choices to stay open even when it hurts. There were still hard days. Days when her pride showed through, when old wounds reopened with careless words. Once she snapped, "You don't have to treat me like a child, Mom," when I reminded her to take her medication. I bit my tongue, not because I was angry, but because I recognized that tone. It was the same one I used to have with my own mother. Pain has a way of echoing through generations if no one dares to stop it. One evening, while washing dishes, she said quietly, "I used to tell people you didn't understand me, but I think I didn't understand you." I turned to her, foam dripping from my hands, and saw something raw in her face. Not guilt this time, but understanding. "It's hard being a mother," she continued. "Harder than I ever imagined. I thought I was doing what was best by pushing you away. I thought I needed space to become who I was. But now I see I was just trying to run from the parts of you that lived inside me." Her words hit me like both a wound and a balm. I wanted to tell her I forgave her, that I loved her, but the words stuck in my throat. So instead, I reached out, wiped the tear that had fallen down her cheek, and whispered, "You came home. That's enough." She smiled, then a soft, tired smile that made her look 15 again. But as time passed, I started noticing things. The way she'd stare at her phone for long stretches, the unread messages piling up on the screen. The way her laughter came less often. One morning, she admitted that her marriage was falling apart. Michael, her husband, had been distant for years. Busy, distracted, absent. The accident had happened after another fight. She'd been driving aimlessly when the car swerved off the road. "I didn't even care if I made it home," she confessed one night, her voice breaking. "That's the truth, Mom. I was so tired of pretending I was happy." I felt my chest tighten. "Oh, sweetheart," she shook her head. "You don't have to say anything. I just needed to tell someone. I needed someone to listen." And so I did. Every night for weeks, she talked, and I listened. about the cracks in her marriage, about the pressure to be perfect, about the guilt that never stopped whispering. The more she spoke, the lighter she seemed, as if years of silence were finally lifting off her shoulders. And as I listened, something changed in me too. I realized that the daughter I'd been mourning wasn't gone. She'd just been lost in a different kind of loneliness. One evening, she said softly, "You know what I remember most from my childhood?" What? I asked. "You never let us see you cry." I smiled sadly. "That's what mothers do, isn't it?" She looked at me for a long moment. "Maybe that's where we went wrong," she whispered. "Maybe if I'd seen you cry, I would have known you were human too." That night, after she went to bed, I stood in the living room surrounded by quiet. I thought about her words, and for the first time, I let myself weep. Not the quiet tears I'd been shedding for years, but deep shaking sobs for everything I'd lost, everything I'd carried, and everything I was finally beginning to let go of. The next morning, Evelyn found me in the garden, kneeling by the old oak tree where Murphy was buried. She didn't say anything. She just knelt beside me and took my hand. For a while, we stayed like that, two women bound by pain, forgiveness, and blood. The kind of silence that once destroyed us now held us together. By the end of summer, she decided to move back to town, not into the house, but nearby. "I want to start over," she said, "but I want to do it close to you this time." I helped her find a small apartment near the lake. We painted the walls together, laughed when we spilled paint on the floor, cried when we hung her childhood photo on the wall. It wasn't the same as before. It wasn't supposed to be, but it was something new, something honest. One evening, as we watched the sunset from her balcony, she turned to me and said, "You know, I used to think time would fix everything, but it doesn't, does it?" I shook my head. "Time doesn't fix. It just gives us the space to try again." She leaned her head on my shoulder, and in that moment, I knew the wound would never vanish, but it no longer defined us. Still, some nights when the house is quiet again, I think back to that Sunday 5 years ago, the day she said, "We'll come next week." And I realize something I never understood. Then sometimes the things that don't come when we want them to come, at exactly the time we're ready to receive them. Maybe next week was never meant to be 7 days later. Maybe it was meant to be 5 years later when we both needed it most. It's been almost 2 years since Evelyn came back into my life. The seasons have rolled gently over us, winters soft, and bright summers full of slow evenings and the quiet rhythm of healing. She visits nearly every Sunday now, sometimes with Nathan, sometimes alone. They'll bring groceries or flowers from the farmer's market, or nothing at all, just themselves. And that's enough. We don't talk about the past often. The words have already done their work. Instead, we talk about the small things: the neighbor's new dog, a recipe she's trying, the book club she joined. Every now and then she'll laugh in that unguarded way that used to fill this house years ago, and my chest will ache with something that feels like gratitude. But not every day is perfect. Healing never looks like it does in the movies. There are still shadows between us, reminders of how fragile love can be when left unattended. Some days she grows quiet, her thoughts drifting somewhere I can't reach. I don't press anymore. I've learned that silence doesn't always mean distance. Sometimes it's just peace in disguise. Last spring, she surprised me with a small party for my birthday. Nothing extravagant, just family, a few of her friends, Nathan and his kids. There were balloons, laughter, and a homemade cake she baked herself. When she brought it out, she grinned shyly. "It's not perfect," she said. I burned the first one. I smiled, cutting a slice. "Neither am I," I said, "but we both turned out all right." Everyone laughed. It felt strange and beautiful to have joy echo through these walls again. For a moment, I caught Evelyn's eyes across the table. She looked at me the way a daughter looks at her mother, not as a ghost of the past, but as someone real and present. I held that moment close, knowing how rare it was. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, she stayed behind to help clean up. When the dishes were done, and the house had fallen into that tender hush that follows laughter, she sat beside me on the couch. You know, she said, for years, I told myself I didn't need a mother. I told myself I was fine on my own. And now I asked, she smiled faintly. Now I know I just needed you. The tears came before I could stop them. I took her hand, smaller now, colder, and held it against my heart. And I always needed you, I whispered. Even when I pretended I didn't. We didn't say anything else that night. We didn't need to. The air itself carried all the words we couldn't find. But in the days that followed, something began to shift again, subtly at first. She started missing her Sunday visits, canceling plans with a simple text. Work's been crazy. Feeling a bit tired today. I told myself not to worry, but the unease crept in quietly, familiar as breath. One evening, when she didn't answer my call, I drove to her apartment. The sky was bruised purple rain threatening on the horizon. Her car was in the driveway, lights off inside. I hesitated before knocking, and when she opened the door, I saw it immediately, the exhaustion in her face, the weight behind her eyes. "Mom," she said, surprised. "You didn't have to come." "I know," I replied softly, "but I wanted to." She sighed, stepping aside. The apartment looked untouched, dishes in the sink curtains, drawn takeout boxes stacked by the trash. I noticed an open envelope on the coffee table, a letter from a law firm. My eyes flicked over the words, "Divorce Proceedings." She saw me looking and closed her eyes. "It's over," she whispered. I wanted to say something comforting, but all I could do was pull her into my arms. For a moment, she resisted pride, always pride. Then she broke, collapsing against me in silent sobs. "I tried so hard, Mom," she said between breaths. "I thought if I worked enough, smiled enough, tried enough, it would stay together. But I couldn't fix it." "You don't have to fix everything," I whispered. "Some things are meant to end so you can begin again." She looked up at me, then eyes red but shining. "You really believe that?" I nodded. "I do now." For the next few months, she stayed with me again, this time not because she was broken, but because she was rebuilding. We cooked together, watched movies, sat on the porch for hours, talking about nothing and everything. I saw her learning to laugh again, to live for herself. One morning, I caught her standing in the garden barefoot, her hair glowing in the sunlight. She looked free, fragile still, but free. "I used to think this house was haunted," she said later, sipping her coffee. "Haunted," I laughed. She smiled. "Yeah." Every time I walked through the door, I felt all the things I'd done wrong, all the things we never said. But now it feels like home again. Her words wrapped around me like a warm blanket. I thought of the girl who once said, "We'll come next week," and of the woman who now sat before me, older, wiser, finally at peace. The ache of those lost years didn't vanish, but it softened, became something almost gentle. Then one morning, she placed an envelope on the table in front of me. "What's this?" I asked. "Read it." Inside was a small, handwritten note and a set of plane tickets. The note read, "For both of us to start fresh. I want to take you somewhere warm, somewhere far from everything that hurt." I stared at her, stunned. "Evelyn, you don't have to." "I want to," she said firmly. "You spent your life giving. Let me give something back." We went to the coast that summer. The ocean air was salt and sun and freedom. We walked barefoot along the shore, collecting shells like children. One afternoon, she turned to me and said, "You know what's strange? I used to think coming home was the hardest thing I'd ever do. But now I think leaving again is harder because I don't want to lose this. I looked at her, the waves rolling behind her, her hair dancing in the wind, and I thought she's come full circle. And maybe so have I. Now, as I sit here on the porch 2 years later, I can see her car parked in the drive again. She's inside, laughing with Nathan over coffee, the sound spilling out through the open window. The garden is blooming tulips, hydrangeas, and that stubborn old rose bush that keeps coming back no matter how cold the winter. Sometimes I still think about those years we lost, the empty Sundays, the unanswered calls, the loneliness that nearly swallowed me whole. But then I look at her now, and I realize maybe we needed that time apart to find our way back, not just to each other, but to ourselves. They said they'd visit next week. It took 5 years. But they came. And maybe that's the lesson I was too blind to see all along. Love doesn't run on our schedule. It comes late sometimes, limping scarred, but still love. Still enough. If this story touched something in your heart, if you've ever waited for someone to come back or found forgiveness when you least expected it, share it. Let others know they're not alone. Leave your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that remind us that healing, no matter how late, is still beautiful.